Please also note on every image that we have rounded corners at the top, but not at the bottom. And therefore at the bottom we have normal corners, even though theoretically our card has rounded corners on all edges. You see this if you load a category for the first time and the image hasn't been loaded yet. Then when you see that white box, you see rounded corners at the bottom too, but thereafter, once the image is there, the normal borders of the image overlap these rounded corners. And that is what we fixed with clipped R erect. Now we're not fixing it on the bottom because as a next step, we'll add more content below the image as well. And therefore the image will not take the entire height of the card or not be the only content of the card. So let's continue working on this now. Let's continue working on our meal item. We have the image, we're clipping its top borders, and keep in mind that the image is part of a stack. That means we can now also add another widget which sits on top of the image. And that's the plan indeed. So on top of the image, and therefore after clip R rect, but still in the widget array here, or the widget list for stack, I want to add another widget which is placed on top of the image. And that should be a text widget. The text should of course display the title of this image here. And I also want to set some style here, not through a theme because I really will only use that style here. I want to have a font size of let's say 26 and then also set a color which should be white. Besides that, I want to set soft wrap to true so that the text, if it should be too long for the card container, is actually wrapped. And I'll set overflow to text overflow fade. So in case that it doesn't fit into its box, even with wrapping, now it would just fade out and not overflow and basically look ugly, but instead it would be cropped, would be clipped in its box that is reserved for it, and just fade out if it needs to exceed that box. Shouldn't really happen, it's just a safety mechanism. With that, we save this and we load Italian food. Here's our text. Now that's okay, but I would want that text placed differently, not on the top left. When you're in a stack, and that's new, we haven't done this before, but when you're in a stack, you can use a special widget which really only works inside of a stack. You can wrap text with that widget by using the refactoring tool and wrap with new widget, and the name of that widget is positioned. Positioned allows us to position the child widget in an absolute coordinate space. And for that we can add a couple of properties, bottom, left, right, and top. So we can tell how far away we want to be from the bottom, from the left, from the right, and from the top in our stack. And the stack container itself is defined by its biggest child, which here clearly is our image. So effectively in the box of that widget here, of that image, we can now position that text. And there we could say that we want to have 20 pixels distance from the bottom and 0 pixels or 10 pixels distance from the right to position it in the bottom right corner. And now if you save this, this text moved down there, which in my opinion looks better. So this is of course just my opinion. You can play around with that and position this differently if you want to. But now we have that text down there. One thing we see, for example, here is that here this text still goes outside of the available box. And to prevent this, we need to make sure that this text, which is configured to fade instead of to overflow, actually has a container that constrains it. So let's wrap the text here into a container widget, and we can now give that container a width. And I want to use a width of 250, maybe even 220 to be a bit smaller than the image. Also to ensure that the text is always readable, even on bright background, I'll add a background color here for the container with the color argument of colors black 54. That's basically black, but with a certain amount of transparency. To be precise, with 46% of transparency or 54% of opacity. And with that, if we now save this, now this looks way better. Now we have that black background. Maybe we now also want to have some padding in that container so that the text doesn't sit directly on the edges of the container. So we can add a padding of edge insets, symmetric maybe to have different padding to top and bottom and left and right. So vertical padding could be 5 and horizontal padding could be 20 maybe. With that saved, this doesn't look too bad. Looks quite nice to me. I'll actually now ramp up the width of that container again, because I, of course, had one mistake. The width of the image is not 250, that's the height. So we can certainly use more width here in the container. And it will fit nicely here into our image. So now these are the images with the title on top of it. I like that style, looks quite decent. Of course, you can style this even more, add rounded corners to that text container if you want to, but I'm happy with that style. My next step is that I, of course, also want to add some information below that image title thing here. So below the image and title, so after this stack widget here, which ends here, but still inside of the column widget, child array, child list here, there I now want to add a row, because now I want to have a couple of pieces of information set next to each other below that image. Maybe add a padding widget around the row before we continue with the row itself to have some distance to the image. So a padding of, let's say, edge insets all 20, so 20 in all directions, and then our actual row child. Now inside of the row, we of course have children, just as we have it in a column. And now, and that as always is totally up to you, I want to have 3 items next to each other here. Each item itself will be a row, because each item itself will consist of 2 widgets. And the 2 widgets that make up a single item here in our outer row is an icon and then also a text. So what's the icon? First, I want to display the duration, so the icon should fit that, and for this we can actually use icons.schedule, which displays a little clock. So that will be the icon. Now I'll also add a sized box between the icon and the text to have some spacing with a width of, let's say, 6. And then the text here will be the duration. The duration for every meal is just a number, and in this app here, that will simply be the duration in minutes. So here I want to output with string interpolation, so with this $sign, duration. And if you only have one variable you're referring to or one property, you don't even need the curly braces. And then also to give the user some idea of what this number means, I'll add min for minutes after this. If we save that, then we see this below our images and titles. That's exactly what I want. Now, besides the duration, we'll have 2 other pieces of information. So in that outer row here, I'll then basically copy this row, which makes up a single information item here in that row. And yes, you could therefore also extract this into a widget if you wanted to. So here, let's repeat that. And the second piece of information I want to output here is the complexity. For that, I think the work icon is a good fit. Of course, you can explore other icons if you have another icon you prefer. And now the question is, what is the text here? Because remember that complexity actually is an enum. And these labels here are not strings. This is not text we can output in our app. These are just human readable labels for us as a developer. The actual value stored behind that is a number. Now, I certainly don't want to output a number here, though. I want to output a text that makes sense to humans. So now we need to translate our enum labels here into text which we can output. And for this, I'll add a getter in my meal item class here, which will return a string because I want to have the text which I output. Then we need the get keyword to create a getter, and I'll name it complexity text because that is in the end what this getter derives, what it gives us. In here, we can now have a couple of if statements to check if complexity is simple, and then we output text A. If it is challenging, then we would output another text, and so on. So we could have if statements like complexity, is it equal to complexity.simple? This is how we use an enum in a condition. We access the value with the dot notation, and keep in mind complexity here is of that type, so this stores such an enum value, such a number. So here we compare if that stored complexity is equal to this complexity, and if this is the case, we could return simple as a text here. Now I say could because that is a perfectly fine approach of doing it, but if you have multiple such if statements, which you would have here. You would have one for challenging and one for hard, and then have different texts here. If that is what you have, then Dart also gives you a different language feature, which we haven't used before, the switch statement. Switch statements also exist in other programming languages. They're not exclusive to Dart, and they allow you to combine multiple alternative if statements into one single statement. For a switch, you first of all define the value you want to analyze. So in our case, that's the complexity variable. That's the part which we compared to other values in our if statement. Then you have curly braces, and now you define multiple cases with the case keyword. Now, these cases are simply the different values complexity could have. So one case is complexity.simple. If complexity is of type complexity simple, then with a colon, we execute the code here below that case, and that colon is important. So then we could return simple here, and even though this code will not run, it's also typical that you add a break statement here. You need it if you don't return here. This avoids that other cases are hit as well. But if you return it, it's technically not required. Since you typically add it in switch case statements, though, I'll add it here too. And now you can add your other cases, like complexity challenging. There I want to return challenging and also break thereafter, and then also have a case of hard here, where in that case, after the semicolon, after the colon, I return hard. And also break here. And then you also typically provide a default case, which is triggered if complexity has a value you're not covering in one of your cases. And the default case here simply could be unknown or anything like that. Now, in case the break statement is not totally clear, again, when you're returning, you don't need it because that will quit code execution here anyways and will not go to the next lines. If you would not return anything, but do some calculation, update some other property, anything like that, then without break, another case could be entered as well. For example, the default case could be triggered as well, even though you already had this concrete case here. So to avoid such strange effects, you add break to make sure that no other case is considered in this switch case statement. Again, it's redundant if you're returning. So now we have complexity text here, and that will just be one of these strings there. And therefore now we can use complexity text as a text value down there. So simply output complexity text. And with that, if we save this, we also see the complexity text here. But now we also see a problem. These items sit way too close next to each other. Now a solution is to go to our row which holds all these items and add main axis alignment of main axis alignment, which, by the way, also is a enum built into Flutter, of course, dot space around, to use this enum value. Because now the items are positioned such that empty space in the row, in that overall row below our image, is split up evenly. Side note, you now also see the bottom rounded corners because now the image is not overlapping them anymore. So with that, let's add our last item here, our last information item. And there I want to output the affordability of this meal. So a fitting icon could be attach money, which is this money symbol. And then for outputting a text here, we again need to transform our enum value into some human readable text. And therefore I will create another getter here, get affordability text, and basically do the same as in the complexity text getter. Take this switch statement, but now of course switch on the affordability, and then compare this to affordability.affordable, and maybe output affordable here. Then here we could have affordability.pricey, and output pricey down there, and also affordability.luxurious, and output expensive, maybe something like this. So of course the text you return doesn't have to match your label name. Also add a colon up here, and with that we can use the affordability text in that third information item here, like that. So this looks pretty nice to me. I'd say these are decent meals we're outputting here in our list. The next step is to go back to navigation and make them clickable so that on a tab onto these items, we actually do go to the detail page for this meal, where we then see it full screen and we also see all the steps and ingredients.